Beneath the rolling farmland between Creswick, Allendale, Broomfield, Kingston and Smeaton lies one of the greatest concentrations of alluvial gold ever discovered on Earth. Not in reefs and not in surface gravels, but hidden deep underground inside ancient river systems buried beneath volcanic rock. In this video, we're following the entire Buried Rivers of Gold trail through the Spring Hill Deep Leads near Creswick, one of the richest buried goldfields ever discovered on Earth. This is a self-guided historical tour that takes you through the remnants of the mines, vanished townships, and buried river systems that produced an astonishing 2.8 million ounces of gold. If you want to follow this route yourself, you can grab the brochure from the Creswick Visitor Information Centre. But for now, let's step back into the 1870s, when this quiet farmland became the centre of one of Australia's greatest gold rushes. When miners uncovered the Spring Hill Deep Leads in 1872, they realised they hadn't just found another goldfield, they had discovered an entire network of fossilised rivers absolutely loaded with gold. What followed became one of the most intense industrial gold rushes Australia had ever seen, transforming this quiet part of Victoria into the richest deep lead goldfield in the world. Across the Spring Hill, Berry and associated deep leads, an estimated 2.8 million ounces of gold were recovered. At today's gold price of roughly 6,700 Australian dollars per ounce, that equates to an astonishing 18.76 billion Australian dollars worth of gold pulled from beneath this landscape. And what makes it even more incredible is where that gold came from. Millions of years ago, long before Europeans ever arrived in Australia, huge rivers flowed through this region carrying gold eroded from older quartz reefs. Then volcanic eruptions changed everything. Massive lava flows poured across this landscape in the past 6 million years, burying the rivers beneath thick basalt. The old valleys vanished from the surface entirely, preserving the gold-rich gravels deep underground, like time capsules sealed beneath stone. But finding them was only the beginning. Mining deep leads was an entirely different world to the shallow alluvial rushes of Ballarat or Bendigo. Instead of digging along creek beds, miners had to sink vertical shafts through clay, sand, groundwater and hard basalt, sometimes reaching depths of more than 100 metres before finally striking the ancient river gravels below. Once they hit the lead, underground tunnels followed the buried river channels through darkness, mud and constant water pressure. Steam engines roared day and night, powering massive pumps to stop the workings from flooding. Winding engines hauled men and ore cages up and down the shafts continuously. Entire industrial complexes rose above what had once been farmland, with poppet heads, boilers, mullikeeps and tramways dominating the horizon. As the gold boom exploded, settlements rapidly appeared across the district. Towns like Allendale, Broomfield and Kingston expanded almost overnight as miners, engineers, blacksmiths, timber workers and families flooded into the region chasing fortunes hidden beneath the basalt plains. Hotels, schools, stores and cottages sprang up around the mines. But many of these settlements existed for one reason only: the buried gold leads. Once the richest ground was exhausted and the mines became too deep or too expensive to operate, populations collapsed just as quickly as they had arrived. Some settlements dwindled into tiny rural communities, others were virtually abandoned altogether, leaving only scattered ruins and old mining scars hidden in paddocks and bushland. And despite the unimaginable wealth extracted from these leads, the work itself was brutally dangerous. Deep lead mining was among the deadliest forms of mining in colonial Australia. Underground tunnels constantly threatened to collapse. Poisonous gases accumulated in poorly ventilated workings. Machinery failures could strand miners underground. But the greatest danger of all was the water. These ancient riverbeds were heavily saturated, and if the pumping systems failed, entire mines could flood within minutes. That danger became horrifyingly real during the infamous New Australasian gold mine disaster near Creswick, where floodwaters burst into the underground workings and trapped miners deep below the surface. Men desperately climbed rising water levels in darkness, while rescue crews fought for days to save them. Some miners survived trapped underground for over 2 days. Others never came home. The disaster remains one of the darkest chapters in Australian mining history, and I covered the full story in my previous video, linked below. Today, most people drive across the region with no idea what lies beneath them. Under quiet farms, country roads and patches of bushland sits the buried remains of one of the richest goldfields ever worked. A hidden underground world that produced billions in gold and shaped entire communities before fading back into silence. Tonight I'm sitting beside a fire on ground where thousands of miners once walked, worked and risked everything chasing those ancient rivers of gold. And tomorrow, it's exploration time. We begin where this story turned deadly, Before the official Buried Rivers of Gold trail even starts, we're standing at the site of the new Australasian No. 2 mine near Creswick, the location of Australia's worst gold mining disaster. If you've seen my full video on the tragedy, you'll know exactly how horrifying this place became. Long before disaster defined this shaft, it was one of the major producers on the Australasian lead. Between 1879 and 1888, this mine alone produced an extraordinary 2,484 kilograms of gold. Even today, the massive Mullakeep still rises above the landscape, one of the last visible reminders of the industrial chaos that once dominated this district. It's also one of the only major deep lead mines accessible to the public, complete with a memorial to the miners who never came home. Just southeast of here stood the new Australasian No. 1 mine, an earlier attempt to exploit the same buried river system. That operation ran from 1868 to 1875, producing 538 kilograms of gold before groundwater became too much to overcome. And that was the defining challenge of these deep leads. Water was everywhere. These ancient river channels were saturated, unstable and dangerous. In fact, it took a staggering 3 years just to sink the No. 2 shaft before the miners finally broke through into payable wash. That gives you some idea of the scale of engineering required to simply reach the gold. From here, we officially begin the Buried Rivers of Gold tour. Site 1 takes us to the remains of the Australasian No. 3 mine. Unlike some neighbouring operations, the total gold recovered here was never publicly disclosed, but the mine clearly worked enough ground to leave behind a prominent Mullakeep still visible today. Like so many of these deep lead mines, the workings themselves have long vanished beneath grass and farmland, leaving only subtle scars to hint at what once existed below. Further along the trail, we arrive at the former workings of Davies Junction and the Australasian Extended Mine, two operations that chased the same hidden river system as the earlier Australasian mines. Davies Junction operated from 1884 to 1887, producing 213 kilograms of gold, while the Australasian Extended ran from 1882 to 1887, winning 242 kilograms of gold. These were shorter-lived operations, but still immensely productive by any normal standard. What makes this stop especially interesting is that we're also standing on the forgotten site of Hollinwood, a township that existed purely because of the buried gold beneath it. At its peak, this would have been a living mining settlement. Workers, families, machinery, horses, noise and smoke. But today, just private paddocks. Nothing left to tell the story unless you already know where to look. The next major stop brings us to one of the giants of the field, Madame Berry West. This was no ordinary deep lead mine. It was one of the richest producers in the entire district, operating between 1893 and 1903 and producing an astonishing 4,400 kilograms of gold in just 10 years. But the gold came at a brutal human cost. The interpretive material here paints a grim picture of what life underground was actually like. The workings were described as cramped, wet, dark, hot and foul-smelling. Miners worked 8-hour shifts, knowing a sudden inrush of water or collapsing drift could kill them instantly. The tunnels themselves formed a maze of reef drives, wash drives, and trucking passages following the buried river gravels underground. Some blocking drives were only around 1.2 meters high, forcing miners to crouch, kneel, or even lie on their sides while extracting gold-bearing wash. A miserable method known as panelling. Timber supports creaked overhead while carbonic gas built up in the workings, causing respiratory illness, dizziness, poor circulation, and what miners grimly called miners' complaint. Conditions became so bad that mine managers were eventually forced to develop positive ventilation systems, mechanically pushing fresh air from the surface underground. Even then, the threat never disappeared. Pit ponies lived underground for their entire working lives. Men relied entirely on each other in the darkness, often forming life or death bonds built on trust. This wasn't prospecting, this was industrial survival. And this is only the beginning of the Buried Rivers story. We've barely scratched the surface of the mines that once chased these lost gold-bearing waterways beneath Creswick and Spring Hill. From here, the trail continues deeper into one of the richest hidden goldfields ever discovered. Continuing north along the Buried Rivers Trail, we arrive at the enormous slime dam of the Madame Berry No. 3 mine, another reminder of the sheer industrial scale of this goldfield. Even where production figures haven't survived, the physical footprint tells their story. Operations here processed vast quantities of wash, and the tailings left behind still dominate the landscape. The exact gold recovered from Madame Berry No. 3 was never publicly disclosed, but given its position on this extraordinarily rich system, it was clearly no small operation. But the next stop is where the scale becomes almost absurd. We arrive at the Berry Consols No. 1 and No. 2 mines. some of the absolute giants of the entire Creswick deep lead field. These mines were chasing the legendary Berry Lead, one of the richest buried river channels ever discovered in Australia. Berry Consols No. 1 alone produced a staggering 5,934 kilograms of gold between 1888 and 1901. That is nearly 6 tons of gold from a single mining operation, an extraordinary amount by any standard. And what made these mines so difficult was the same thing that made all deep lead mining so dangerous: water. Enormous volumes of groundwater constantly poured into the workings, threatening to shut everything down. The Berry companies had no choice but to fight back with engineering on an extraordinary scale. Here stood one of Victoria's great industrial achievements, the giant Cornish beam pumping engine, built to keep the Berry workings alive. This was no modest machine. The Berry No. 1 shaft reached around 180 metres deep, and the pumping system was designed to move an astonishing 60,000 gallons of water per hour, more than 6.5 million litres every single day. The beam itself weighed around 50 tonnes, rocking back and forth as steam power drove the pumps far below ground. This wasn't just mining anymore. This was Victorian heavy industry pushed to its limits, all in pursuit of gold hidden beneath an ancient riverbed. Even that wasn't always enough. Contemporary records describe constant battles against flooding, smashed timbers, blocked pumps, and repeated shutdowns while the machinery fought simply to keep the mine from drowning. The surviving Berry pump house ruins still stand today, silent brick remnants of what was once one of the most advanced pumping systems in the Southern Hemisphere. Standing there now, it's hard to imagine the deafening machinery, the steam, the crews working around the clock, and the desperation to keep water from reclaiming the mine. From here we catch a glimpse of another heavyweight, the Berry Consols Extended, which operated from 1897 to 1908 and produced another 3,250 kilograms of gold. Again, an extraordinary figure. These buried rivers weren't just rich, they were outrageously rich, producing gold on a scale that seems almost impossible today. And like every major mining centre, the gold created entire communities that have now almost completely vanished. Nearby once stood the townships of Lawrence, Jerusalem and Dibdin, settlements that existed because thousands of workers needed homes, supplies, workshops, pubs, schools and services close to the mines. Today almost nothing remains. Just paddocks, roads, and the occasional subtle clue that a bustling industrial settlement once stood there. Then we reach one of the most astonishing production stories on the entire tour, the Berry No. 1 mine. Unlike Berry Consols No. 1, this was a short-lived but incredibly rich operation. It ran for just 1 year, from 1888 to 1889, yet in that single year, produced an extraordinary 1,555 kilograms of gold. That kind of output is almost hard to comprehend. And this is where the buried river concept really becomes tangible. The Berry Lead itself runs north to south beneath this landscape, yet if you look around today, there's almost nothing to suggest a massive gold-bearing river ever existed here. The modern drainage is little more than Birch's Creek, a small quiet watercourse cutting across the paddocks from east to west. I've prospected it myself, and yes, there is gold there, but barely any, just colours. Nothing that would hint at a colossal buried river beneath your feet. Because Birch's Creek isn't the river that made this Goldfield. That ancient river is gone. Millions of years ago, before volcanic eruptions buried the valley beneath basalt, this would have been a completely different landscape. A massive, energetic river system powerful enough to move enormous volumes of gravel and concentrate incredible amounts of gold. Then the lava came, sealing it all underground and rerouting the drainage entirely. What remains on the surface today is just a faint, almost accidental shadow of what once existed here. And that's what makes this place so surreal. You can stand beside a tiny trickling creek, in total silence, while beneath your boots lies the ghost of one of the richest rivers of gold Australia has ever known. As we continue, the landscape starts giving away more clues. Rising out of the paddocks is the enormous mullock heap of the Hepburn Estate No. 1 mine, one of the few unmistakable scars left behind by this buried gold empire. This operation worked the rich Hepburn Lead, producing an impressive 1,864 kilograms of gold between 1886 and 1900. Even after more than a century, the scale of the waste rock pile tells you this was serious industrial mining, not some small speculative shaft. Every ton of that mullock was hauled up from deep underground in the pursuit of buried river gold. Nearby once stood the township of Clementston, another settlement born entirely because of these hidden leads. Like so many places along this trail, it no longer really exists. No miners' cottages, no hotels full of exhausted workers at shift change, just farmland. Yet for a time this would have been another busy node in the machinery of the gold rush. And all around Clementston, different companies were attacking different sections of the buried river system. To the south was the Earl of Beaconsfield mine, tapping into the Hepburn lead and producing 747 kilograms of gold. To the south, another company took an even bolder gamble. The Lord Harry mine sank its shaft through the volcanic flank of Birch's Bald Hill, punching directly through the basalt that had buried these ancient rivers in the first place. That mine operated from 1884 to 1891, recovering 194 kilograms of gold. Not a giant by the standards of this district, but still a remarkable return considering the difficulty of the ground. And then we arrive at the undisputed king of the entire field, the Madame Berry No. 1 mine. This wasn't just the richest mine on the Berry Lead, it was the richest gold mine in the entire Deep Lead field. In just 4 years, between 1881 and 1885, this single operation produced an absolutely staggering 12,045 kilograms of gold, more than 12 tons, from one mine. To put that into perspective, that's over 387,000 ounces of gold, worth roughly 2.6 billion Australian dollars at today's gold price. This was the crown jewel of the buried rivers. The interpretive material here makes it clear just how extraordinary this operation became. At its peak, Madame Berry employed over 250 men, and was regarded as one of the most celebrated mines in Victoria. This wasn't simply a successful gold mine, it was a massive industrial complex and one of the largest mining operations in Australia at the time. And the mine's beginnings were just as dramatic as its output. The shaft hit the Berry Lead at around 138 metres depth, and on the first cleanup, miners reportedly found coarse gold covering the bottom. One extraordinary bucket of wash supposedly returned around 700 ounces of gold. That kind of discovery would have sent absolute shockwaves through colonial Victoria. By 1887, the company had driven 15 kilometres of underground workings and removed an estimated 2.4 million tonnes of wash in pursuit of the gold-rich gravels. Looking at the historic reconstruction of the surface works, this place was enormous. Boiler houses, winding houses, tramways, crushing batteries, timber stockpiles, slime dams, horse-drawn haulage systems, an entire industrial city built around a buried river. And yet, like all deep lead mines, it was always one step away from disaster. Madame Berry No. 2 battled uncontrolled inflows of drift and water so severe that conventional methods failed, forcing engineers to devise bizarre telescoping iron cylinder systems just to push through unstable ground. These weren't normal mining problems. These were engineering wars against geology itself. Standing here now, with only grass, fences, and interpretive signs left behind, it's almost impossible to process what once existed beneath your feet. The richest buried river gold mine in the field, now reduced to a quiet paddock in country Victoria. Beyond the Madame Berry giants, the trail keeps revealing just how absurdly rich this district really was. We next reach the site of the West Berry Consols No. 2. Unfortunately, no production figure appears to have survived for this mine, but standing beside the enormous Mullock heap, it's obvious they reached payable wash and worked substantial ground. Deep lead mining did not generate waste piles like this for speculative failures. Every tonne of barren overburden had to be hauled up from depth at enormous expense, so a heap of this scale is its own evidence that gold was found. From here we move into another section of the buried river system, and arrive at the Laughlin No. 1 mine, one of the earlier major successes on the field. Operating between 1881 and 1884, this mine extracted 1,187 kilograms of gold from a section of the buried drainage known as the Lewis Western Lead. Once again, a remarkable figure for what was effectively a narrow target, hidden deep beneath basalt and sediment. And nearby lies another vanished township, Ristori Town. This is one of the things that makes this goldfield so fascinating. These weren't just isolated mine sites. Entire communities kept appearing, disappearing, and in some cases literally moving as the gold rush migrated across the buried leads. Ristori itself was named after the famous Italian actress, Adelaide Ristori, because apparently even mining directors in the 1870s had a flair for dramatic naming conventions. By 1903, nearby Allendale had become the principal centre of the Spring Hill Deep Leads, with 9 mines in operation, railway access to Melbourne, multiple hotels, a police station, post and telegraph office, courthouses, schools, a mechanics institute, churches, a fire brigade, and a population of around 1,600 people. This was a proper boomtown economy built entirely on buried gold. And then when the mines faded, so did many of the towns. Of the roughly 10 settlements created to service the goldfield, most simply vanished. Clementston, Hollinwood, Dibdin Town, Jerusalem and Lawrence, Wallace Town, and Ristori Town either dwindled into nothing, were dismantled, or in some cases literally shifted elsewhere. Houses were jacked up, loaded onto wheeled frames, and hauled away by teams of horses to follow the next mining boom. Imagine entire homes rolling down country roads because the gold had moved on. That actually happened here. Just south of Laughlin sat another strong producer, the Dykes Freehold Mine. Operating from 1887 to 1883, it recovered 1,227 kilograms of gold, making it another heavyweight in a district where a ton of gold almost feels routine, which is perhaps the most surreal part of this story. In most goldfields, a mine producing 1,000 kilos would be legendary. Here, it's almost just another stop on the trail. And that really puts the Spring Hill Deep Leads into perspective. This wasn't a single lucky discovery. It was an entire industrial landscape built on multiple buried rivers so rich they created towns, fortunes, engineering marvels, and eventually ghost settlements scattered across the paddocks of Western Victoria. From here, trying to document every individual mine becomes almost impossible. The Spring Hill Deep Lead system had exploded into a maze of workings, with well over 24 mines scattered across the buried river channels, many of them producing hundreds of kilograms of gold in their own right. Some lasted only a year or two, others survived longer. Some figures were meticulously recorded, others vanished into history. To keep this video from turning into a 3-hour documentary, I'm going to leave the historical map and production table on screen here so you can appreciate just how dense this goldfield really became. Because what this map makes clear is that by this point, miners had moved beyond simply following obvious discoveries. They were systematically hunting the hidden rivers themselves. Diamond drilling allowed them to probe through the overlying basalt and sediments, map the ancient gutters, and target the buried leads with increasing precision. This wasn't random prospecting anymore. This was geological detective work backed by capital, engineering, and industrial ambition. Even then, the smaller mines were still pulling extraordinary amounts of gold. We next reached the Bunyan's Freehold Mine, which operated in 1875 and produced 250 kilograms of gold before closing. For a mine that only lasted a single year, that is an extraordinary return. Not far away was the Hawkins Freehold Mine, also operating in 1875, producing another 164 kilograms of gold. Again, these are numbers that would define an entire gold rush elsewhere, but here they're almost footnotes in a district overflowing with riches. And finally, we reached the last stop on our Buried Rivers tour, where 3 more forgotten producers helped bring this story to a close. The Lewis Western Mine worked a section of buried river known as the Lewis Western Lead. It operated for just a single year in 1874, yet still recovered 92 kilograms of gold. Nearby, the Robinson's Freehold Mine, also active for only 1 year in 1874, produced an impressive 314 kilograms of gold. And then there was the Richardson's Western, operating in 1875, which added another 405 kilograms of gold to the district's already staggering total. And that really says everything about this place. Even the so-called smaller players were producing gold on a scale most fields could only dream about. What began as the discovery of buried tributaries beneath Broomfield Gully in the early 1870s triggered something extraordinary: the systematic exploitation of what would become the richest deep alluvial goldfield on Earth. Ancient rivers that had been dead and buried for millions of years suddenly became the focus of one of the most intense industrial gold rushes Australia had ever seen. Entire townships appeared from nowhere. Hotels, schools, banks, churches, fire brigades, tramways, railway links. Families moved in, investors poured money into increasingly ambitious operations. Massive steam engines fought endless groundwater. Men worked in darkness, heat, poisonous gas, and constant danger, all to claw gold from rivers that no longer existed. And then, just as quickly, it all faded. The mines closed, the machinery fell silent, the towns emptied. Houses were hauled away to the next boom. What remains now are paddocks, ruined foundations, forgotten mullock heaps, and the occasional interpretive sign hinting at what once happened here. Across this buried river network, 2.8 million ounces of gold were recovered, roughly $18.7 billion at today's gold price, from beneath what now looks like ordinary Victorian farmland. Before we leave, there's one stop that feels fitting: the 1872 Deep Lead Monument, erected in 1939. This simple memorial marks the discovery that changed everything. Just over 100 yards from this point, in May of 1872, rich gold was struck, the discovery that opened up the Spring Hill Leads and transformed this district into what the plaque proudly calls the richest deep alluvial goldfield in the world. And looking back at everything we've covered, that claim is hard to argue with. But there's something else worth pointing out here, because even after journeying this entire trail, the full story still isn't complete. If you look at the historical maps, one thing becomes obvious very quickly. The mines we've visited are only part of the picture. South of the new Australasian No. 1, there's a dense cluster of workings following what was known as the Red Streak lead. But this wasn't some completely separate buried river system. The Red Streak was actually a branch that joined the Australasian lead, feeding into the broader buried drainage network that made this district so extraordinarily rich. What's frustrating is that while the maps clearly show this intense concentration of mining activity, production figures for many of these individual operations simply aren't readily available. We can see where the miners went. We know that we're chasing payable ground, but for many of these workings, the exact gold totals have been lost to history. And that raises an even bigger point. Even with all the documentation that survives, we're still only seeing part of the story. And then there's something even more interesting. Near the Eaglehawk mine, right in the middle of that cluster, another ancient watercourse appears on the mapping, a smaller channel that seems to intersect or possibly connect with the Australasian system. That tells us something important. These weren't just isolated rivers. This was likely a far more complex buried drainage network, with tributaries, abandoned channels, diversions, and multiple generations of river systems preserved beneath the basalt. Then you notice something stranger still. Isolated leads that appear to begin and end without obvious connection to the larger systems. Former tributaries, small local drainages, rivers that formed after the first volcanic eruptions, only to be buried themselves by later lava flows, ancient watercourses that were only partially mapped by 19th century miners. The honest answer is we don't know for sure, because despite everything that was mined here, not every lead was ever found. The Victorian miners were brilliant, but they were working with the tools of their time: shafts, guesswork, geological intuition, and eventually diamond drilling. Today, with modern geophysics, buried paleochannels can be mapped far more effectively, and geologists have already identified ancient lead systems that 19th century miners never discovered. Some may still contain gold that has sat untouched for millions of years. And that's the incredible part about this story. It isn't entirely over. The Spring Hill deep lead rushes may have ended, the steam engines are gone, the town's vanished, the miners long since passed into history, but the buried rivers remain beneath Victoria. And not just here, across the state, hundreds of ancient leads still lie hidden underground. Some known, some suspected, some perhaps completely undiscovered. So while this chapter of Victorian mining history may feel finished, maybe it isn't. Maybe somewhere beneath these paddocks, beneath the basalt, beneath the silence, there's still another buried river waiting to be found. And maybe one day, mining begins here again. I hope you found this as interesting as I did. And as always, thanks for watching. Before I end this video, I'd like to give a big shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Thank you so much to everyone that helps to support this channel.